Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to Shaping Tomorrow, Season 3. I'm Syafiq Borhannuddin, Senior Research Officer at IKIM. In this episode 4, we're having once again Mr. Syed Muhiyuddin from HAKIM to talk about a monumental figure in the history of Islam in the Malay Archipelago, Syekh Nuruddin ar-Raniri. Welcome, Syed.
Thank you, Syafiq.
Okay, Syed. Perhaps we can begin by shedding light on his biological as well as his intellectual lineage. Where does he come from, basically?
Yes, Syekh Nuruddin ar-Raniri, which according to our teachers is one of the two greatest figures in the Islamization of the Malay Archipelago, was born in a port town called Surat, which is in Gujarat, and that is how he got his appellation ar-Raniri, Randir, through which most of the Malay people know him. He came from a family of a noble family of scholars. The surname Al-Hamid, not to be confused with the Hamid from the Ba'alawi line of the Sheikh Abu Bakr, but according to Prof. Al-Attas, his family, the surname came from of the Masyaikh family, descending from one of the 10 tribes of the Quraysh. We know, for example, that he is closely related to Muhammad ar-Raniri, Al-Hamid, his uncle, who came earlier in this part of the world in the 16th century. Nevertheless, we know also from the biography written by Professor Naqib Al-Attas in the commentary on the Hujjatul Siddiq that he carries many appellations. One of which was that he is of the Shafi'i madhab, he is of the Ash'ari theological school, and he comes from a blend of Persian as well as Arabic Sufi masters. The line which includes, of course, Imam Al-Ghazali, the line that also includes Junaid al-Baghdadi, and also, of course, amongst the later ones, what is included in his silsilah is the line of the Aidarusi order. Coming as such from the Hadrami background, it is most likely that in terms of his upbringing, he was trained in Hadramaut. We can also be certain, based on some of the biographical reports, that ar-Raniri went to Mecca in about 1620, like that. In terms of his, so when I mentioned already these names, Shafi'i, Ash'ari, these are all not mere names, but also shows the intellectual tradition through which he came from. Right. The intellectual tradition that Raniri came from also is reflected in the books that he wrote, in the literature that he cited in his works, which would be later very important as we study some of his works.
Okay. Now, he would later on leave a very strong impression or mark in Aceh in particular, but whose impact would be felt in the rest of the Malay Archipelago. But can you share with us how did he emerge as a Sheikhul Islam later on in Aceh?
Yes, we know from the previous discussion, the one we had on the Aqaid and Nasafi, that with the fall of Malacca to the Portuguese in 1511, Aceh was rising rapidly to become the spiritual, economic, cultural and religious as well as political center of the Malay Archipelago. What had happened was that it became first a commercial center, and through a series of vigorous sultans, in particular Alauddin, Riayat Shah, as well as Iskandar Muda, and then later followed by his son-in-law Iskandar Thani, Aceh was slowly attracting the best talents, shall we say, from the Muslim world, amongst which who came to, of course, we know in the 16th century we had the likes of Hamzah Fansuri and Shamsuddin Sumatrai, but by the end of the 6th century, the 16th, and the beginning of the 17th century, meaning to say in the 1600s, we find that Sultan Iskandar Muda went to Pahang, and there brought back a prince of young age who would later succeed him, who would be groomed to be the next sultan and to become his son-in-law. Now, it is here that is most likely that Raniri first made his mark, meaning to say to become the tutor to the young Iskandar Thani, and then gradually, due to the close relations, not from him, but not only just from him, but from the family relations, that gradually Raniri would emerge as the Sheikhul Islam of Aceh, in particular for the periods between in the 1630s and towards the end of the 1640s, nearly 10 years of rule as the Sheikhul Islam of Aceh, which is by then the most prestigious religious office.
Could you share with us what was his contributions, the intellectual output, shall we say, and to what extent was the influence of his writings?
Yes, we know already that from what is mentioned just now, the intensification of the Islamization of the Malay archipelago, in particular due to the contributions of Hamzah and Shamsuddin Sumatrani, that in the 16th century Hamzah Fansuri had already written poetry in the form of shairs, as well as some prose works introducing for the first time into Malay language doctrines of the Sufis. And so what would have happened by then meant that the people are now starting to talk and imbibe some of these contents. We have already by 1580 we know of as recorded in Raniri's Bustana Salatin, a major work of historiography or Malay historiography that talked about public debates, intellectual debates that were happening in the courts, in the masajid, in the public spaces, talking about these central doctrines. So when Raniri came to assume office as the Sheikhul Islam, his rich background, as we mentioned just now, would come to bear. One of the first things that he did as he assumed office was to clarify the distinction between false and true Sufis. And this was especially needed during those times because owing to the rising interest in tasawwuf, and owing to the possibility of misrepresentation of the works of Fansuri as Sumatrani, the writings of ar-Raniri being of voluminous as well as very penetrating forms of writing would put first Sufi tasawwuf and metaphysics in its correct order. But we also know that Raniri had contributions in various other disciplines, like the discipline of hadith, in which his work arguably is perhaps the first collection, the Hidayatul Habib fi Targhib wa Tarhib, collecting some ahadith of the Prophet within a work. Previous to Raniri's writing of the Hidayah, you know that ahadith are found usually in the works of law. They are also found perhaps in the Malay annals, here and there interspersed, so such that people who come to know tradition or hadith from the prophets would have to gather it from these various other genres instead of a particular book in hadith. In this regard, Raniri is a pioneer also in a number of other fields in Malay language especially. We mentioned hadith and tasawwuf, but also in the realm of aqidah. We know that towards the end of the 16th century, as we said the last time, the Aqaid was already translated in full. However, we know that even in a full translation like that, it is difficult to understand some of the more recondite matters of the Aqidah. It requires a sharah, a commentary, and this commentary would be provided by ar-Raniri, whereby he translated one of the best, perhaps agreed upon by many scholars to be the best commentaries on the Aqaid an-Nasafi, that is by at-Taftazani. Right. So Raniri's work in Aqidah is equally important, meaning to say in that when he introduced the Sharah of the Aqaid an-Nasafi, it helped to fortify the Islamization process. Right. Furthermore, aside from Aqidah, Hadith, as we said, also Tasawwuf, he also wrote perhaps the largest work in the Malay language, in classical Malay literature, which is the Bustana Salatin, right. Which is a book in world history in a sense, because first it contains theological history about the creation of the world. There are also books and volumes on the history of the Malay kingdoms, and then there are in the rest of the Bustan a tradition of mirror for princes, in the sense of the Nasihatul Muluk of Imam Al-Ghazali, in which the book is composed and designed as an ethical program for future princes and future men who would assume greater responsibility. Finally, there are also in terms of his contribution is included the Sirat al-Mustaqim, which is perhaps the most popular writing by Sheikh Nuruddin ar-Raniri, and this is because it is found in the as a side work, meaning to say found on the corners of the pages of a later work on fiqh by Al-Banjari, the Sabil al-Muhtadin. So this Sirat al-Mustaqim is important because it is also the first text of fiqh being written in the Malay language, and that aside from providing shall we say judgments on the matter of the 5 daily prayers and other matters with regards to fiqh, it is also a source of technical terminology in the Malay language.
So would you say that his writings are predominantly written in Malay, the Jawi script?
Yes, of course we know that.
This despite him coming from an Arab lineage and residing or growing up in the subcontinent.
Yes, this is very interesting indeed. There are in fact scholars who said that Raniri had a Malay mother, although that may be important, but inconsequential where with regards to what is the definition of Malayness as already founded during these times, because at that time being Malay as it is now for perhaps the nation state of Malaysia, being Malay meant that you spoke the language, that you are it is not an ethnic concept per se, because despite knowing that Melayu as a term may refer to a specific ethnicity, but there was also the concept of the Bahasa Jawi, which means the users of the language and people who were as such, this would qualify Raniri as one of the scholars belonging to the Bahasa Jawi tradition. But nevertheless, by saying that all these works are being written in the Malay language does not mean that he wrote solely in the Malay language. We know that after he returned from Aceh to Gujarat, he would spend a good 14 years still writing more works, and this time in Arabic. So the works that he had written in Malay serve to provide foundations for our civilization, but he also contributed to more general Islamic scholarship.
Perhaps for us to better appreciate where he is situated in history, so perhaps you could shed light on the global context of where Sheikh Nuruddin ar-Raniri was. Basically, he lived in 17th century, and historians such as A.C. Grayling regarded it as the age of genius, perhaps referring to the proliferation of geniuses and intellectual outputs of that time. So perhaps you can try to share with us further on this regard.
Yes, of course that work by A.C. Grayling on the century of genius or the age of genius was trying to focus more on what was happening in Europe. He was talking about that century where the likes of René Descartes flourished, and so did Baruch Spinoza, and you have also Thomas Hobbes. They discovered during that same century, the Harvey, I believe, discovered made genuine discoveries in human anatomy, and Thomas Hobbes wrote the foundations of political philosophy and civic society, whereas Descartes made revolutions in the realm of philosophy. In particular, he was responsible for introducing our dualistic conception of the world, whereby we understand that the world is composed of substances, extended substances studied by physics, and the spiritual aspect or the mental aspect. So we can see that violent yes, it was a violent century in the sense of religious wars, but also violent changes were happening in the mind in Europe. I mentioned just now Spinoza. Spinoza also was responsible in preparing and paving the ground such that modern philosophy after the 17th century tended to focus just on the physical world. On the other hand, we know also that largely in the world, it wasn't just in Europe that these great things were happening. We know that in Turkey, for example, was during that century you had Ismail al-Ankaravi, yes, from Ankara, who basically introduced and developed Ibn Arabi's thought within the Ottoman Empire. We know also that in Iran, in the Persian Empire at that time, you had Mullah Sadra, who through his Asfar al-Arba'ah, yes, the four journeys, as well as his Hikmah Muta'aliyah, his great writing on Sufi metaphysics, in which he combined, he was approaching the connections between physics and metaphysics. Great achievement in the sense that that Islamic philosophy after Mullah Sadra was greatly affected by it. And at the same time, you have also the great Sufi revival and reform and societal revival and reform in Hadramaut, chiefly through the work of Imam Abdullah ibn Alawi al-Haddad. So you can see that all these separate regions in the world were all heavily impacted by what was happening in the 17th century. And we have now strong reasons to argue that even in the Malay world, something of that international stature, of world stature was happening due to the writings of ar-Raniri. Of course, as I said just now, these independent regions, although they are perhaps functioning separately and they have their own logic based on the streams of thought that they came from, nevertheless the 17th century remained an important one, to such an extent that I think if we were to be honest about what was happening in the Age of Genius, if we were to write our own version, we would still include what was happening in Europe, but we will not discount what was happening in our part as well as the other parts of the world.
Yes. Now, Syed, perhaps in the remaining section of our conversation, we'd like to learn more as far as his contemporary relevance. Now, it has been 400 years since he lived, but how would you see his perpetual contribution that is still perhaps can contribute to contemporary discourse?
I think one of the things that we need to appreciate about Sheikh Nuruddin ar-Raniri, which we have perhaps already alluded to just now, was his persistent effort of clarifying and refuting errors, the important intellectual as well as the practical aspects of the religion. I think this perfectly fits with the more general theory that Professor Naqib Al-Attas has tried to propound or has been propounding over the past 40-50 years about the Islamization process, which is proper to the Islamic civilization, wherein in Historical Fact and Fiction, I remember reading, he mentioned that Islamization is a process that needs to be continually enacted and reenacted by the Muslims, and this is especially needed during times in which the Muslims find themselves straying or departing or deviating from the true spirit of Islam. In this regard, Raniri's contribution, for example, when he came here, I forgot to mention that he also introduced the field of comparative religion, found in his Tibyan fi Ma'rifati Adyan, a first of its type, in that not only was he comparing between the existing religions, ar-Raniri was also mentioning the deviant groups and sects within the intellectual tradition of Islam, thereby contributing to the field of, say, Islamic heresiography in the Malay language, which was never before produced and written. So in the tradition of Milal wal Nihal, in the tradition of Abdul Qahir al-Baghdadi, so by introducing these new genres, as Raniri had done, he further clarifies what is the truth vis-a-vis and in relation to falsehood. Now that spirit, I think, is something that the Muslims today need to imbibe, because And this cuts through both divides of those who want to introduce change and those who want to preserve. Raniri represents the spirit of what Professor Wan Muhammad Noor would call dynamic stabilism. That there is a strong core belief and practice, orthodoxy and orthopraxy, that needs to be preserved. But this strong core of belief and practices, in a sense that they are rooted in revelation, in the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet, can also commandeer through changes. So that is why when Raniri applied, for example, the rational method to refute the pantheists, the monists, in particular those who were confused, and at that time, especially the challenge of the wujudiyah, those who were, shall we say, they fell victims to their own confusion when they mistook the proper position of human beings vis-a-vis God and the world in relation to God. These things were not clear, perhaps due to the nature of the language, as well as their own tendency to become confused. So when an ar-Raniri set in writing the clear metaphysical position between God and the world, between man and God, he effected therefore the Islamization that we are trying to look for, as well as we said, his writings in fiqh and the various other disciplines. So taking that spirit into action in our time, the Islamization that is needed also involves some of these elements. In particular, in the epilogue of the commentary on the Hujjatul Siddiq, which Professor Al-Attas has done creatively and brilliantly, he writes about how the foundations in Raniri and the school that he represents amongst the Sufis, how it can be developed to be the basis of an Islamic philosophy of science. This is because due to his deep and penetrating insight, Professor Al-Attas has discovered that there is something deeply, I wouldn't say just problematic, but also contradictory in the modern philosophy of science. And we're not saying this as a matter of trying to be oppositional to, say, Western philosophy, but rather to look into the problems inherent in modern philosophy and metaphysics, in the sense that what had happened in the West, this problem of secularization, the problem of looking at the world as, shall we say, a permanent entity wherein you have one thing developing out of other things, and also the reduction of man to a mere extension of the biological species, and the reduction of the cognitive powers of man to only his rational thinking, and the rejection of revelation, and the rejection of the spiritual aspects of man and the world. Now these things properly are the subject matter of philosophy, or rather the subject matter of philosophy of science. However, although the truths of these philosophic concepts have not yet been demonstrated, it has been taken as the basis of modern philosophy of science. So the result of which, it has confused many Muslims to the extent that they thought that since the metaphysical basis, which we said, this philosophic basis of modern science, I mean the fact that the science thrives despite this atheistic and secular foundations, they thought therefore that India will view, they thought therefore that their religious beliefs is unjustified, unwarranted, and so therefore they hold on to religion merely as for example, as a means of mythological or fideistic type. But in reality, as Prof. Al-Attas has been arguing, the works of ar-Raniri and scholars of the Tasawwuf tradition can be used, in fact, as the basis of a philosophy of science without negating the beneficial aspects of modern science.
I see. So does that mean that had the Malays or the Muslims in this part of the world continue to benefit from the contributions or the writings of Sheikh Nuruddin Raniri, the trajectory as far as the education system and scientific pursuits and civilizational enterprise as a whole would have been in a different direction. I mean, is this what you're saying?
Yes, certainly. Of course, these things are recondite matters. I mean, it's not easy when we're dealing with this sort of very sophisticated matters just over a few episodes on radio. These things will take years perhaps to master, but at the very least, what we have been trying to say in the tradition of our teachers is the idea that something really problematic about the present shall we say worldview or the present educational content is that it has been taking and imbibing the conclusions of Western philosophy, not to say Western science, which are problematic to begin with, which are taken as axioms through which the scientific enterprise is built upon. On the other hand, we can say that we can salvage the beneficial aspects of modern science without subscribing to the problematic metaphysical picture. And the consequence of subscribing to the metaphysical picture is that it divorces and removes religion from the cultural landscape. It results in the secularization of minds, and it denies people of the right to believe with a firm and strong knowledge basis. So we see again in the tradition of An-Nasafi, which was discussed last week, as well as the writings of ar-Raniri, in that our scholars have already provided for us a firm basis of knowledge through which you can have a scientific culture, a scientific enterprise, without there being a divorce and distance between values and facts, between reality and facts.
Before we conclude, Syed, maybe in the remaining 5 minutes or so, would you say that with the rediscovery of Sheikh Nuruddin Al-Raniri and his significance in this part of the world, would you say that he ought to be kind of inculcated or imparted in the consciousness of the people in this part of the world to be a kind of a iconic cultural figure, just like how Muhammad Iqbal is in the subcontinent?
I would agree with that. Interestingly, by providence, I suppose, the commentary on the Hujjatul Siddiq of Nuruddin Al-Raniri is published by the Ministry of Culture in 1986. So therefore, which is the right place or the right publication in the sense that the Malaysian government, meaning to say, takes responsibility or to publish the work of such a great author, such a national treasure that we have, done by also another national treasure, Professor Syed Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas. Taking the cue from what the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, La yashkurullah man la yashkurun nas. He who does not thank mankind is not thankful or grateful to God. The importance of highlighting the continued relevance of Nuruddin Al-Raniri in the shaping of our consciousness is again back to the significance of the word shajarah, meaning to say the tree. Great trees rely on roots and firm seeds and foundations. The foundations that has been set by ar-Raniri and the standards that he has left is so high to such an extent that he continues to remain a source of shall we say a role model for what the Malays can aspire towards. If we want a nation of scholars, a nation of thinkers, even a nation of scientists, a nation of entrepreneurs, creative people. These are all found in the being of Nuruddin Al-Raniri. So I think if we highlight his role, this will do justice to what we have set forth in the earlier episodes about how history should be focused on great individuals, great events, as well as great ideas. As for as for ar-Raniri, he combines in himself all these three. That he was in a sense a great man to begin with. He represents a great tradition of ideas, and the events that was shaped around him happen as a result of him. So if the Malays today can properly appreciate ar-Raniri, I don't think it is impossible to perceive that it will change the social ethos, and it will create and recreate again a culture of knowledge, a culture of learning.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been with Syed Muhiyuddin from HAKIM, talking about a monumental figure in the history of Islam in Malay Archipelago, who is Sheikh Nuruddin ar-Raniri. Thank you once again, Syed. With that, wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.